are Vineyard.
Somos Viña.
We are Vineyard.
Paul doesn't do ethics from moral theory. Paul does ethics from Christology and creation. The world was designed a certain way, it's fallen in a certain way, Christ did a certain kinds of thing. Therefore, we should forgive one another. Therefore, he did a thing for you. Therefore, this is the kind of person you're going to be. So frames are really key, because then when people start living in the Bible, they preach out of those frames. I know people like to do systematics. I think those are helpful. But I like biblical narrative, biblical frames, then systematics, so that when you look at a preacher and say, what do we want to say about the Holy Spirit? Their mind jumps to a few chunks really fast. They go, Galatians 5, upper room discourse, John 15, John 16. We could do that bit in Exodus where the Spirit comes upon them. They're bouncing through the story in certain ways and through the frames of the Bible. I don't think most people have been trained to read the Bible like that, let alone preachers. So I spent a lot of time just getting them in the Bible before I'm even showing them how to work texts or think about communication. Because if the Bible starts mapping their thinking, they'll preach biblical messages.
Welcome to the We Are Vineyard podcast, conversations to help us grow with Jesus and each other. Today is the next installment of a preaching mini-series that's hosted by Adam Russell, the lead pastor of Campbellsville Vineyard Church in Kentucky and the director of Vineyard Worship, and Ted Kim, the lead pastor of the Evanston Vineyard in Illinois. Today they're flipping the script, and our usual host, Jay Pathak, is going to be the one getting interviewed. Let's listen in.
All right, what up, everybody? This is the We Are Vineyard podcast, and I'm not your normal host. I feel like I've taken the keys from Dad, and I'm here with Ted and Jay. Jay, did we just steal the car from you for a couple weeks?
You did. You stole the car, and you threw me in the back. I'm handcuffed in the back seat.
Well, I just want to say thanks for letting us steer for a couple weeks here, Jay. Appreciate it.
Oh, it's fun, man. I love this.
Okay, so here's what we're going to do. This little series on We Are Vineyard is all about preaching, and we're just wanting to emphasize our Vineyard story through the practice and the art of preaching. I mean, that's what we are. We're pastors here. And what we want to do this week, Jay, is we want you to be our guest, and we're going to put all the questions to you. Is that all right?
Okay. I mean, we'll try.
All right, because
it'll be hard to not want to ask a question back. I'm going to do my best.
I'm going to ask you to refrain.
To resist it. Okay,
yeah,
I'll try.
We're asking you to resist that.
Yeah. So what we want to do this time, Jay, is we want to talk to you about a couple things here, but I'll just start with this question. Very basic. What is a good sermon? Like, how would you know that it's even decent?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, first of all, we just have to acknowledge that teaching on a Sunday anywhere is a weird experience in that it's an uncontrolled environment. Nearly every other time you speak in your life, you know the room. So if you're a school teacher, I'm going to teach these students. If I'm doing a sales presentation, I know the people I'm selling to. I know their names. I've been able to do my work ahead of time. Sundays are uncontrolled environments. Any given Sunday, you don't know who's going to come. You don't know who's going to be there. You might have some sense of it. But somebody brought their grandma for the first time ever. Or all the people you thought were going to be there aren't there. So it's tricky. I like Rick Warren's little argument where he says, most people preaching in America are preaching to a parade. Like, people are moving through.
Yeah.
And on any given week, you're preaching to a certain part of the parade. So in order to answer what's a good sermon, you have to acknowledge, wow, it's difficult to know your audience. So for me, what makes for a great sermon is it's intriguing, like people actually are interested in what you're doing. It opens the world of the Bible to the world of today in a way that it drives towards the will. That you work with people's minds, you work with their hearts, but you're calling them into a way of life with God. You're bringing them into the world of the Bible to live in the world of today, and they actually have to do stuff because they heard you speak today.
So as part of what I'm hearing you say here, like when you're talking about involving the will, you're wanting to ask something of them, make a step, make a move. Is that part of what you're saying?
Yes, every time. I mean, so, I think maybe one way of answering this is what isn't a good sermon. So,
yeah, go for it. I love that.
like there's great talks that are interesting thoughts. There's great talks that make me feel good or feel bad. And those are fine. But if we don't land in the will somehow, like I'm going to live differently. I'm going to make some decisions with my life today. I don't know that we preached a good sermon, or there's good talks that are great information, but they don't bring you along. The content in and of itself, like if you were reading it, that's good content. But in the sort of public form of communication, you didn't reel me in. You didn't draw me forward. And that's where I think preaching is, you have to do a lot of work around how am I getting these people to come with me, and where am I taking them? And is it bringing them into the world of the scriptures to help them see what their life is now, to give them a biblical lens for their life?
Okay, before I let Ted jump in, let me just ask you another question kind of on this idea of what is a good sermon. So it's bringing the world of the Bible into the room. We want to preach at people's will. We want to ask them to take a step forward. How good were you at that when you were 20, Jay?
Horrible.
Say more about being a 20-year-old preacher and being someone who's got a couple decades in now.
Well, I think, I'm doing preaching classes all the time. I'm in one right now, where I have people write little sermons and we all come together, we do things. The thing I notice in every newer preacher is they have great ideas. They have something they read somewhere that they're super excited about, and they cannot wait for people to get this idea. And so, I wasn't thinking about how to bring people in. I wasn't thinking about how to make it simple and clear. I think when you're insecure as a communicator, you want to make sure everybody is impressed with all the ideas that you have. And frankly, it might be because you're impressed with those ideas, but the vast majority of people in your room haven't thought the 8 thoughts that you've thought in order to think the 9th thought. So you're giving them that 9th thought that's just like, isn't this the best? They've not thought any of the previous 8 thoughts. And so much of the work with young preachers to me is getting them to relax inside of their own bodies, first of all, to just be at ease in front of people, to not make it too complicated, to bring people with them and say something really clear. So I was terrible at everything I just described. And I studied philosophy. So I like ideas. Ideas make me want to cry and laugh and gather all my friends together. Most people, as we study audiences, and sociologists help us do this, are concrete people. They like ideas that they know what to do with and grab. Most preachers are conceptual. So if you're preaching to yourself, you're probably missing the vast majority of the audience.
That's a challenging word.
And as I think back when I was young, I was just talking to, if there was any philosophy student in the room, they probably loved it. But I don't think anybody else liked it very much. They didn't get it. Yeah.
Well, I love that. And I love that you're just admitting that you weren't always a genius, that you even Jay has grown in this, and that no matter where you start, you can get better, right? Is that what I'm hearing?
No, it's way worse than that. No, it's way worse than that. Like if you could talk to Rich Nathan, who did a lot to train me, I would come in and do a sermon every week for him for what ended up being like 4 years. So every week I'm doing sermons, and I'd say at least a third of those, he would start laughing almost instantly. Like not in like a nice way. Like this is bad. Like this is so bad. And then he would just go, what does that mean? Like, what do those words mean? I'm like, well, they mean this because it relates to that. And he'd be like, nobody knows what that means.
I love that.
So,
I love it.
Yeah, that was like a lot of reps. It was bad. Really, really bad.
Well, I'm curious, Jay, like if there's a good Vineyard sermon, like if there's a sermon that demonstrates fidelity to our movement, like what makes a good sermon actually a Vineyard good sermon?
I mean, for me, it would be, and there's more than one way to say what I'm about to say here, but I'll say it succinctly. I can say it differently. If a sermon doesn't drive towards a ministry moment, you probably didn't get a good Vineyard sermon in my mind. Because great preaching should make us aware of our need for God, how the things that the scriptures require of us require a dependency on the Spirit.
Yes.
And require the intervention of God for healing, for empowering, for hope. And so if we're preaching sermons that end with, well, thanks for coming, have a great week, I'm not sure that we drove people towards an awareness of the Holy Spirit and the presence of the kingdom. If our sermons drive to, so there's some of you today that you need to be filled afresh. You're saying, I want to be a person who loves my spouse, who cares for my neighbor. I don't have that. Well, we want to invite you to experience something of the Spirit today. There's some of you go, man, I want to be this kind of person. What you're describing is real. I'm so beat up. There's healing for you today. The Lord is here to heal you, to free you. And so great sermons in our context lead towards ministry. And that's why, I mean, you guys have been in rooms with me where we're not in the Vineyard. How many times we finish and everybody's sitting there like, I think we're supposed to do something now. Like we need something to happen. And it's because that's our expectation as Vineyard people, is the Lord is present with us, and the opening of the scriptures should bring people to a place of receiving from the Spirit and encountering the kingdom in the room right now, today.
That's so good. I'm curious, Jay, was that something you learned under Rich's tutelage? Was that something that you came into? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, I mean, some of it's my way of coming to know Jesus was such an intervention. So I think part of it is, I think just as a discipleship thought, I don't have an expectation that what God requires of me, I'm able to do. Now, you can hear that in a bad way. The bad way to hear that is you're going to live in shame and you're always behind and you're kind of a loser. That's, I mean, if I was going to stereotype, that's kind of the Reformed problem, so to speak. Like, that's stereotypical. I know that. All my Reformed friends just got mad. But I'm just saying that's the problem there. But there's a positive way of saying that, which is, no, what God requires of you, he gives you. It's imputed righteousness to comfort my Reformed friends again. And there's a way of experiencing a life with God that you can expect God to come at any moment and help you. And if your preaching does that, you can preach higher than you're comfortable for yourself and for others, because you're going, what if God came and filled us today and gave us the boldness we need to be evangelistic, gave us the heart to care for the marginalized and the poor in a way that we're barely caring for our friends. And the scriptures say, love the foreigner among you. How can that be done? You know how it can be done? By the power of the Spirit. And so we're going to ask God to do that today in all of us. So I think part of it is my own discipleship journey is mostly one of desperation. It's how I came to Christ. And God has been faithful. So my confidence he can do that for other people is really high.
Okay, so Jay, let me shift gears here just for a second. That's maybe some good sermon stuff. Mm-hmm. Talk to us about what you think a good preacher is, or what makes a good preacher.
Well, Ted and I have joked about this a decent amount. So I think that the man or the woman is actually the message. So you could teach an unchurched, unskilled non-believer to give a good sermon with skills. I mean, there's a series of stand-up comedians we could get to do some pretty good Vineyard sermons. So we have to be careful that we don't just make everything skill-based. I don't know how to describe it. It sounds a little woo-woo-y, but I can tell when somebody's living inside of their own message. I can intuit it. I can feel it, like watching them talk. And an unskilled communicator that's preaching from their spine, there's an authority on them.
Wow.
There's power on them. But the super skilled one isn't. It doesn't matter. It's like, so you're super skilled, but you're not preaching from your spine. That's a problem.
Yeah, my own spiritual father, Ray Hollenbach, when I was first coming up, I was really nervous about, I wanted to preach, I felt called to preach, but I was really nervous about it. And Ray told me no less than 1,000,000 times, oh, Adam, don't worry, the message is already in you. And I was like, at first it frustrated me. But he was kind of getting at what you're getting at. It's like, it's who you are. Just,
yes.
Let God say the things that he would say through you, which, now that I've done this for a couple decades, makes a ton of sense to me. In the moment, didn't make much sense to me. But yeah, I resonate with that.
Or have the guts to notice when it's not. I've had moments I'm writing a sermon because I know it's true. I know it's the Bible. And I have to have this horrible realization. I'm not sure I'm living into this the way I want to be.
Yeah.
And so how do I honestly assess that? Like this week, this month, this is part of the reason I'd advocate for trying to write talks further in advance, to not be on a 6-day cycle, to try to be scoping out frames, to be like, okay, we're going to be talking about racial reconciliation because we think it's what the Lord is asking of us. I don't have that. Like, I don't have a personal story. I don't have a way of getting to that from my own life. Okay, that's in 10 weeks. I'd like to be able to live into this for a minute.
Oh, yeah. I like that.
Lord, what are you asking of me in the next month or the next 2 months? So I think, again, you can... it sounds woo-woo-y, but I can tell when somebody's living a talk and when they're not. You can just feel it in the spirit.
So you're doing a lot of training. Sorry to interrupt, Jay, but you're doing a lot of training of young preachers right now. And I'm so curious as to what that looks like. I mean, that idea, how do you communicate that idea? What do you have your young preachers doing to live into the text and to live the message?
Well, the first thing I do with young preachers is I try to get them used to seeing the Bible as a whole. So a lot of the training we do in the first few weeks, first few months is, can you tell the whole story of the Bible in a page or two? Then I'm trying to get them to read the Bible book by book. So an outline, I usually start with Ephesians. Outline of Ephesians, outline of the Gospel of John, outline of Romans, outline of Genesis, outline of Exodus. And I want them to be able to pull those frames from memory. So what starts to happen when you start to see the Bible as a whole and books as wholes and where those books fit into the overall story is it starts to get into you. You start to say, okay, my ethics are always grounded in my Christology, for example, because that's how Paul does ethics. Paul doesn't do ethics from moral theory. Paul does ethics from Christology and creation. The world was designed a certain way, it's fallen in a certain way, Christ did a certain kinds of thing. Therefore, we should forgive one another. Therefore, he did a thing for you. Therefore, this is the kind of person you're going to be. So frames are really key because then when people start living in the Bible, they preach out of those frames. I know people like to do systematics. I think those are helpful. But I like biblical narrative, biblical frames, then systematics, so that when you look at a preacher and say, what do we want to say about the Holy Spirit? Their mind jumps to a few chunks really fast. They go, Galatians 5, upper room discourse, John 15, John 16. We could do that bit in Exodus where the Spirit comes upon them. They're bouncing through the story in certain ways and through the frames of the Bible. I don't think most people have been trained to read the Bible like that, let alone preachers. So I spent a lot of time just getting them in the Bible before I'm even showing them how to work texts or think about communication. Because if the Bible starts mapping their thinking, they'll preach biblical messages.
This summer, Vineyard USA is hosting our national conference, Seed and Soil, in 2 locations, Denver, Colorado on June 17th through 20th, and Cincinnati, Ohio on July 15th through 18th. We hope that by offering 2 locations and dates, everyone, pastors, leaders, volunteers, even those just curious about the Vineyard, everyone will be able to find a time to join us. The conference will have specific programming for adults, youth, and kids, while we focus on cultivating healthy soil in our hearts and planting seeds for the future for all that God wants to do in us and in the Vineyard. Registration is now open with early bird pricing, so make sure to check out vineyardusa.org to learn more and register today.
Jay, let me ask you this. Talk to us about the difference between preaching like big moments and a regular Sunday. And let me just define big moments for a minute. Christmas Eve, Easter, funeral, like maybe tragic funeral. Young kid dies. They're a big part of your church. Or maybe there's some citywide event and they tap you and they say, hey, would you bring a message? Talk to us about being a preacher who can handle regular Sunday. Or what's the difference? Or how do you think about regular Sunday versus big moment?
Yeah, regular Sunday's family meal, right? So you're thinking about at least a few months at a time, probably a year at a time. So family meal is different than the big banquet moment for the wedding or whatever. So family meal, we want a balanced meal. We want a balanced diet. We're going to cover a variety of topics over a year. I still like thinking in the cruciform frame. What's vertical, what's going towards God, what's horizontal, what's going towards each other, and then how does that totality reach out? So in a missional framework. So those 3 realities, you're spacing out over a year. You're doing book studies to make sure people are in the Bible. So that's family meal stuff. Like you don't have the best, like craziest, opulent meal every day, every night. I mean, maybe some of you do, but you might for once a week. You might for the, all the kids are home kind of thing. So even in the family meal, there might be some bigger moments. I think that the other things, it's all audience driven. Like when you're doing a city event, that's like a different audience. That's not family meal time. We have a whole bunch of guests, we're at a different kind of thing. And for me, I'm asking, what are the key questions people are bringing to this event? So they're bringing something different to this room than a Sunday room. So a funeral, the question everybody's asking is, why did this happen? What does this mean? How do we make sense of the brokenness of the world? That's the question. So if you just read some kind of Psalm 23 thing and get off the stage, you didn't answer a question. That's the question they're asking. And I think it's incumbent upon you as a communicator to answer that question. And in a large citywide movement thing, frankly, people might not even be asking a question. They're sort of bored. So you try to give them the question you want them to ask, which is, what's the point? Like, why are we here? Does a life with God matter in a city? Or how do government leaders work with pastors? Or can we even work together? How do we manage a polarized moment? So you're spending time asking, what are they asking and what should they be asking? And that takes a second of reflection. It might even take a little reconnaissance, like who's in the room and what is this and how is this different than another room and what's the history? You know, I've gone and done city events in other cities where their city movement is dealing with racial tension maybe that another one isn't, or so some is reconnaissance. So what are the questions? How do I answer them? How do I get to this? And it's also different because the room doesn't know you. So you usually have to do a little bit of work trying to get them to answer the question, why should you talk to me? Why should you listen to me?
Yeah, that's right.
So Jay appeared from Denver, and we're in Jacksonville. Okay. Who is this guy? Why should I listen to him? So you have to give some sense of credibility, and you can't just let your intro do that. You guys say, you should listen to me today. I have something to say.
Well, Jay, let me dig here just for a minute, because we were talking about like good sermons, good preachers, and now we're talking about big moments and regular Sunday moments. Family meal, I love that frame from you. Talk to me about growing in those areas just for a moment, because sometimes it's like the skill that it takes to be a really good Sunday morning preacher is very different than maybe being on the stage at Exponential or you know, handling a tragedy in front of human beings. A few months ago, I was listening to NPR, and out of nowhere, I hear the voice of Alan Austin. You know, there's a shooting in Maine, and I didn't know Alan was going to be on NPR that morning, and he did so well. I mean, I was like filled with pride and just gratitude that these people were being pastored so well. But there's that thing, like Alan had what it took for the big moment, but I also know that he's got a growing and healthy church, so he's got the regular Sunday thing too. Talk to me about, you know, maybe there's a preacher out there who's like, okay, I feel like I've sort of got Sunday morning down, but I you know, great, the questions, yeah, all of that. But Jay, my heart just beats out of my chest and I lose my emotions, or my mind goes blank when the moment gets serious, or maybe there's like a prickly subject. Like, what do you do? Like, how do I not freak out and start saying stupid stuff?
Yeah, well, I would say if you're the less controlled the environment, so interview, big stage somewhere else, intense moment, the more controlled you have to be. So the less controlled it is, the more you have to be really clear about what you are and are not going to do. So basic press training, for example, for politicians is you decide what you are and are not going to say, and you don't care what question they ask you. So like you have to be prepared to say, in this moment where there's been a city tragedy, I want to make sure people hear, though the world looks dark, God is good and he's alive.
Yeah.
There is help for you no matter what emotion you're experiencing. And we need a life with God in order to make sense of blah, 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 blah. Okay, those are the three things I want to make sure I get to say today. Great. So then they look at you and say, well, this person apparently had been in a church and they did this horrible thing. What do you want to say about what's the role of the church in contributing to violence in America? Okay. If you're not smart, you answer their question. You start, coming up with ideas about that. Like, I do wonder, has the church contributed to whatever. You just, you let them drive. No, you have to drive in that moment. You're the one driving. So you say, that's a very good question. Here's the truth. God is the one who gives us hope. And without a life with God, we don't have any hope. And the fact that people get that wrong sometimes is really disappointing. But here's what you need to know. Here's what's important. And you just go to where you know it needs to go. But that requires having a sense of self. I know who I am. I know the moment we're in, and I know what it means to lead right now. I'm not letting someone else lead. I'm here to lead towards the kingdom. And I want Jesus to be lifted up. And so that's what we're saying today. And good press will do everything they can to knock you off of that stuff. but or a big moment. It's like, well, we need you to actually do this. No, you should be thoughtful. Do your best to connect to what's going on, but that's stuff you do in your own prayer closet. That's stuff you do alone. And you have to be prepared in your mind with what amounts to 3 or 4 8 to 10 second bites that you feel good about. And I imagine, it's funny you mentioned Alan, because when it all went down there, I called him and said, you're about to be put on a stage. Like, think about what you want to say and don't say anything else, no matter what. Like, say what you want to say and don't say anything else.
Well, the clip that they had from him where he was addressing, the city at the prayer vigil, it was so good. It was literally so good, and it just underlined for me that thing that I think about when I think about a good preacher, of being somebody who can handle Sunday morning, but then also handle this other thing. I was very, very impressed. It was awesome.
Well, and the Sunday's a little more controlled, so you can try some things. I'm going to see these guys next week. So, okay, here's a thought. And I don't know, that didn't work. Well, I'll see you next week. We'll do some other stuff. But in that context, you are not taking risks. You're hitting the center really clear.
Jay, one way to have a really good wine palate is to drink really good wine. It it imprints in your brain. You go, oh, yes. I actually know what's good, right? If you only drink Yellowtail all the time, you'll never know what's good. Do you have any suggestions for who we could listen to? Who have you listened to that formed your preaching palate? Who gave some definition to the good?
I love Tim Keller. I really do. I think Tim is just great. His ability to show you the left side, the left ditch and the right ditch and the middle road. That's sort of his classic preaching style. He always creates the right kind of tension. He's super well read. He's very practical. And his outlines flow from the text. So I could listen to Tim Keller forever. And I have no ability to preach like Tim Keller. Like none. Like if I tried to preach a Tim Keller sermon, I'd be dead. Be over. No, I'd be over. It would just sound like gobbledygook. I wouldn't be able to do it. He carries so many things in his mind at the same time, and he covers so much ground. And that's why I like listening to him, because it pushes me. Like, wow, I would never be able to pull this off. But it pushes me to think through tensions in different kinds of ways that I wouldn't normally do. He's incredible. He's incredible. And I don't think anybody should probably attempt to preach like him. For what it's worth. So
I love that.
But anyway, I know that can sound like I'm trying to drive you crazy, but I think it's good to just get pulled in a certain direction. I really like Dr. Tony Evans. I love his preaching. I think he's in the kind of Keller way. He's really thoughtful. He has very smart, helpful, complex things to say. But his ability to illustrate and apply is off the charts. Like, he gives you this, he tells you this story and you can't quite tell what's about to happen. And all of a sudden you're like, oh my goodness, that connects all the dots. He did it. And he just drops it in so that's what that means for you, husband. Here's what this means for you, teenager. When you think about, you're an older retiring person, see what that means, blah, blah, blah. He's amazing. He's amazing. He's amazing. And again, he's so different than me. His style, obviously his cultural background, he's just so different than me that I am compelled. And he preaches right down the middle of the text. I love how he communicates. Another guy's totally different than me. I like Chuck Swindoll. I mean, all his old stuff. I mean, it's like I'm sitting with Grandpa. And he's so theologically different than me in a lot of ways, right? Like, he's going to try to work his way around healing as for today and stuff. And so it's helpful for me to just kind of get pushed. Like, that's really interesting that you did that in a way I would never do it. I love listening to Beth Moore. Again, she's so different than me. And she gets excited about stuff that I'm not that excited about. Like, but no, I'm serious. Like there's an energy. She'll jump into one part and I'll be like, that's really weird. I would have just read right over that. So I guess what I'm trying to say is I like to try and listen to great communicators who do things that I don't do very naturally, but they're good at it. And then people that aren't preachers, I like stand-up comedians. I think they help us do stuff that's they trick you is kind of the way they make you laugh. If I don't mean like lowbrow comedians, I mean smart ones. Like observational humor is really helpful for preachers. Yeah. Little turn of phrase, they surprise you. Storytelling. I think stand-up comedians are really interesting to watch because they're good at communicating. So those are all my all the time listens.
If I could pull on one little thread, Jay.
Yeah.
I'm interested in something that just to go back to the late Tim Keller, who I also deeply admire, who preached like thousands of sermons.
Yep.
And was a guy, I think, interesting enough, even though he's so erudite. I mean, a lot of it's just coming straight from his spine.
Yes.
So he's not writing these voluminous manuscripts. He's oftentimes, sometimes even getting up there off the cuff, teaching and preaching. The demands were so high. And just that preach from the spine thing requires a certain secure sense of self, rootedness in our identity as beloved daughters and sons of God, and just not the way that we can kind of get in our own way with our insecurity that would make us I wish that everyone in the room thought that I was really smart, or I wish that everybody in the room thought I was really funny, or I wish that everyone in the room would just not leave the church because I've just taken it over. I'm very, very scared that you're going to leave. And to put it crassly, take your handsome tithe with you. Right. So I feel I'm somewhat terrified, and obviously I'm speaking a little bit from my own experience.
Sure.
In a way that the secure sense of self keeps me from letting me preach from the spine. In a way that the secure sense of self oftentimes will make me fixated on the sermon and not paying attention to the leadership of the Spirit in the morning. And I just wonder, surely I cannot be alone. And I wonder if there is a word that you might give to us listening about that. And what would you say to us? How would you advise us? What wisdom would you have to give to us who find ourselves in that predicament?
I mean, again, this is going to sound so simple. So I could be simplistic. But I really, it's important for preachers to really love the Scripture. I don't know how else to say it. Do you find yourself actually wanting to read the Bible? Yourself? If you didn't preach another sermon? Because this is where I think it gets tricky. When you're preaching a lot, you turn your devotional life into sermon prep. I think that's a real problem. So for preachers, do you have a Bible reading plan? Do you have some kind of commentary or something that just puts you into the Scriptures that is for you? It's life-giving. And again, we all listen to preachers, and we can tell the ones that have clever sermons versus ones who really just love the Bible. They love the Bible. And what that does in the background is then when you come to a sermon series where you've already been doing other kinds of work just on your own life from 3 or 4 months ago, you remember that moment where the Spirit met you in the morning reading that passage, and you're like, oh yeah, that's right. This is here. You're drawing from your own well. And again, I'm not saying you have to do the Bible in a year over and over again. There's all kinds of great resources. I love to search the Scriptures by IVP. I do love the Bible in a year. But even like a great readable commentary that just puts you in a book that you're like, I'm not preaching this. I'm not preaching Corinthians, but I'm going to live in Gordon Fee's commentary for a minute. Because it's just magical, the stuff he's drawing out. Or I'm going to read Jesus Through Middle Eastern Eyes, a book that's helping me understand the context, just because I want to. I want to grow. And that's what I saw in Tim Keller. Like, I got to be with Tim, I don't know, 4 or 5 times in small rooms of pastors. And what you watched him do on the stage was him. Like, we'd be talking, and he's just like, oh, man, you know what that makes me think of? I read this commentary on this thing, and it changed my life. It changed the way I understand the nature of the law and how the law is intending to bring us to grace. And he's saying it like his eyes brighten up, sitting with like 5 pastors having dinner. So when he goes to write that sermon, it's because that's living in him. That's in there. He's pulling from that well. And so, again, I was given an opportunity to watch him up close. And I would just say, great preachers that I've ever been with alone, like if I'm just with them, like at a coffee shop or somewhere, that's a consistent trait. They're not professional sermon crafters. They are people who just love the Bible. They love the text. And they've chewed through some tricky parts. Sometimes it takes trying to figure out, what do I think about this text?
Yeah.
To fall in love with it. And they've done that work. And so when they go to write a sermon, they've got all this stuff in them. They can just pull from. Actually, most great preachers are leaving 2/3 of their best stuff on the cutting room floor. Yeah. Every sermon. I mean, so yeah, that would be my observation. And it's true of me. There's seasons where I can tell I'm not as in love with this right now. That's a problem. I need to shift something. I got to change something in the rhythms of my life to be grounded differently.
Man, Jay, appreciate that. Feels like you shared some good stuff with us, man.
Good. I'm glad. Yeah.
I think that's actually very helpful. And even more than just making a resource for other people, I feel the challenge in the things you were sharing today. So
cool.
Man, Jay, thanks for letting us take the car out for a spin, okay?
No, hardly. It's our car. This is our car. We're all taking turns.
This is our car. This is a family car.
It is. That's exactly right.
It's a sedan.
You got it.
All right, everybody. Till next week. Peace.
Peace.
As we celebrate our 50-year anniversary in the Vineyard, if you're interested in learning more about Vineyard history, there are plenty of resources for you. Check out our show notes for links to books, YouTube videos, and more to learn about Vineyard history and identity. And make sure to keep listening to the podcast this year for stories of Vineyard churches throughout the year.